Crossing over, Exhibit 204. Somehow I have arrived in a strange land. It turns out I speak the language, and there are people I seem to know. Here I find the Larry Colker Museum, disturbingly close to completion. Locked in glass cases, the blue wooden top my father taught me to spin. The bare arm and shoulder of a young girl, the first kiss, the varsity letters, the razor blade, the recurrent dream of flying and falling, the letters full of half-truths and cowardice. There is not enough heat in this place, and I can't get used to everything turning gray. Buildings, food, flowers, hands, eyes. Music gets harder to hear. At the other end of the hall, a small child is crying, asking his parents if they can go home now.
In an interview for Poets and Writers, you say that one's poetry is a reflection of one's identity. By identity, you mean our personal mythology and what makes us who we are. If we search in your poetry, what could we find, or who could we find in the personal mythology of your work?
I think the person that comes across in my poems is wry and melancholic. So I seem to be wired for some kind of, melancholic view, or I have kind of a, a predisposition. Other people are just happy-go-lucky all the time, and that's great, and I didn't get that card. For some reason, what I choose to put into poetry is, in a sense, to externalize this sadness, if you would, makes it objective and less weighty. And once you express it in words, and it gives me some perspective to share it, and it just doesn't seem as significant. I hope that it's been transformed, however, into something that other people like to look at, so to speak, or a well-crafted poem. So it's the making of something that works out of it that's the reward for me.
You have published, I believe, 4 chapbooks, At the Curb, Car Waiting, Boy Standing in 1997, What the Listener Knows in 2003, Hunger Crossing in collaboration with Daniel Greeley in 2005, another one called Girl with Tattoo Heart, Boy Standing in 2008, and then you have a full-length book called Amnesia and Wings, published by Tebot Bach in 2013. How did you start as a poet?
I think my first poem was for my parents' 20th anniversary. Why in the world would I even think of writing a poem? Okay. I trace this back to a book called The Child's Treasury of Literature that happened to be on the bookcase opposite our bedroom in our home. And it had short stories, it had excerpts of novels, it had poetry. It was just a collection of literature for children. And for some reason, around sometime between 10 and 12 is my guess, poems struck me as marvelous little machines, in contrast to the prose. The rhythm, at the time, it was all very strictly rhymed and metered, like most poems, for children. But it seemed that there was another kind of making involved than just writing a story. That, it has to fit like this. It has to work like this.
You define your poems as concise, and I think we all could agree that your poems are concise. You say that you know when a poem is finished because the poem says what you want it to say, and it is concise, and it is as concise as you can make it without unnecessary words.
Right.
So how is your editing process to achieve this concise poem?
Removing words. or rephrasing so that there are fewer words and it's more direct. If I can drop the verb, I'll drop the verb, as long as the sense comes across, for example. I may change the line breaks. It's really a kind of an excision, a little surgical thing. Can I do without this word, or can I redo this phrase so that it flows more in language, in fewer words? And sometimes I'll add words because I actually want the space. I want the beats in the poem.
When you remove words, are you afraid that the poem is going to become too cryptic?
I make sure that doesn't happen.
But there's a little game there, is that right?
Yes, it's how much can you remove it and leave, sufficient meaning, I guess is what you're saying. Yeah. Yes, I can be oblique, but I don't want to confuse.
Who is your first reader?
My first readers are the audience at Coffee Cartel. That's where I take new stuff. I go to the mic, I read it, I see what it feels like to read it, and I try to feel the audience response.
And then from that response you make modifications?
Yes.
Is this something that the audience does, or is it something that you feel when you read the poem?
There are two aspects. One is the performance of the poem. I would not like to write a whole lot of poetry that cannot be comfortably read aloud. So the first thing is, do I stumble? Have I made an awkward phrase or something like that? Or if I left out a word, or do I continually say the wrong word? Meaning I've chosen the wrong word or something. It's not flowing. So that's the first kind of feedback in performance. And the second is, they applaud after every poem at Coffee Cartel. And, that gives me a little bit, but I can look and kind of sense, as a reader, if you aren't totally you aren't totally new at this, and I've been doing this for, 16 years, I can somehow get a feeling from the audience. And then the other thing is, people will come up afterwards sometimes and say, did you write that poem? Is that your poem? I really like that poem. Once in a while. So I get that little bit of feedback. Or not.
Yeah. But it's true, when you read, I think there's a quality in the silence that tells you that the poem is flying, the poem is working.
It's hard to put into words, ironically, but yes, there are ineffable things that happen as you read in real time. As the words go out in a stream, nobody's writing it down. It has to work in the stream of sound. And you kind of know when that gets choppy or bumpy.
Yeah. Or sometimes you are reading and you change the word because at the moment you realize that, oh, this is a better choice.
It's happened. It has.
And the one is printed.
Yes.
What's your biggest fear when you're writing a poem?
That it will be maudlin, uninteresting. It won't have any flash. I can write stuff that, maybe does certain acrobatic things, but if nobody cares, if it doesn't, what do you call it, incite something in the reader, it'll be flat. That's probably the biggest fear, is that it's, like a souffle that goes.
There are many constant themes in your poems that they appear.
Okay.
For me, there are two themes that are essential in your poetry. One is desire, and the other one is multiplicity. And I think you write about desire in all its manifestations, like it is inevitable, or is animalistic, or sublime. also sometimes desire appears as a force that can justify any transgression. And then what happens is desire makes the poet somebody else. Desire turns you into somebody else, and that's where I think the multiplicity happens. Like you write, the poetic voice appears, but then you also appear as a character or as an observer. There are many angles in the poem.
My summer neighbor makes coffee with a French press, which looks like it could be a glassed-in gazebo for the tiny lizard sunning itself while I smoked on the library steps in town. And watching her make 2 cappuccinos, I'm thinking, I'll bet that's something Capuchin monks never drank, not even after smoking a heretic or 2 on the steps of the monastery library. Not even on a crisp morning like this one in alpine woods, where shades of brown and green defy enumeration, where now the color I focus on is the mottled bronze beige of the foam, which might be best described as fawn. The color of her tanned hand, now reaching toward one of the handless mugs, thumb and fingers spreading in precise anticipation, as I imagine they do when reaching for a man's cock, lifting the filled mug with exquisite command of gravity and inertia, guiding it toward my own similarly poised hand, though in my case as if ready to encircle a breast, revealing how the same ordinary gestures serve the mundane and the sublime, like a monk kneeling in a garden and in a church, and how, like the lizard, we navigate the immense world in search of warmth. Hold out our hand for it, carry it to our lips.
You studied, I believe, Roman languages, is that right?
Romance languages.
Yeah, and Romance languages, and also you studied psycholinguistics.
Psycholinguistics, yes.
Is that an influence in your poetry writing?
It may be more of a toolkit.
Okay.
I have no idea why I have such an interest in languages. When I was younger, I could learn them pretty easily. At the time, languages were taught mainly through grammar, more than through conversation and orally as they are today. So I've got a pretty good handle on grammar and can throw that language around pretty well. Then psycholinguistics entered the picture when I became interested in early childhood education and child development, and how do children acquire language.
Yeah.
So that's developmental psycholinguistics, but psycholinguistics has a lot to do with language, how the brain and the mind figure out language.
So you believe the influence of that in your writing is more just as a toolbox?
Yes, I absolutely want to avoid syntactic ambiguity. And if I need to change a verb from this to, say, the present participle to avoid some parallelism and an ambiguous antecedent, right.
You will do it.
I will do that. No mercy.
In another interview, you explain that you have 2 criteria to recognize a successful poem.
Yes.
One is you want to reread it or to rehear it, and the other one is you want to tell somebody about it. Do you have successful poets that you go back to, that you reread, or that you talk about?
Because I am so much with the contemporary poetry scene and around so much poetry that's being created right now. I go to Brendan Constantine, I go to B.H. Fairchild, I go to Suzanne Lummis, I go to Tony Hoagland, and you can kind of get a sense there. They're in a genre, or they're over in a certain corner at the poetry party, where the so-called stand-up poetry crowd, and where humor and self-deprecation play a big role.
And also you can hear them, because you can
Derek Brown is another. But Derek Brown is so excellent in performance, I send people to his performances on YouTube, for example. those are some examples that come to mind right off the bat. For a while it was Sharon Olds. I just thought she wowed me with some of her poems.
You have a very active presence in the Los Angeles literary life or literary circles. You are the winner of the 2006 California Writers Exchange. I think you are a board member for Beyond Baroque, is that right? You serve as a webmaster for Poetics. I think Poetics, I don't know how to define it, it's like a big calendar where all poetry events are posted.
Its primary use is its calendar and list of venues. So G. Murray Thomas does the hard work of collecting that information, sends it to me, and I merely post it on the Poetics site. So we update the calendar every month and the list of venues, sometimes twice a month.
And then the other collaboration is for the online magazine Speechless. Is this with Susan Loomis, or is this I don't know if it's like the two of you or it's a group of people working for Speechless? Could you explain what the Speechless is?
Began as a page in Poetics, and Suzanne broke off Speechless. That was her idea. It's a themed online magazine, speechlessthemagazine.org. I don't think there's anything like it, but it's Suzanne Lemis's brainchild. And because I knew something about content and websites.
And then, of course, your other contribution to the literary life of Los Angeles is the Coffee Cartel,
Redondo Poets.
Redondo Poets. You have been there for 15 or 16 years. Aren't you surprised that you still have like poets and listeners that go to this poetry?
The audience has changed. Do you know what turnover is in a company? Well, we've had a huge turnover in our audience over the years. It happens over and over again. You start with perhaps some regulars, and then some new people show up, and word of mouth reaches other people. We have a very young audience right now. Late high school, early college is the majority of our audience. Although the age range of the readers extends probably from 15 or 16 to 60 or 70. You know, we have an open mic. You hadn't mentioned that, but we do have the open mic, and that's what brings people to the Coffee Cartel. And it's become a kind of a hangout on poetry night.
Tuesday
nights, right. Yes. And people who never occurred to them to write a poem of all things. You know, they get urged on by their friends, you know, who are there to read, and they try it. And so every week we have somebody who's never performed a poem in public before.
You said that your audience have changed. So since you have been a witness of this event for the past 16 years, have you seen changes in the styles of the poetry itself,
right,
or trends or movements?
The people who read in the open mic and the features had almost none of the hip-hop culture influence. We're talking 15, 16 years ago.
Okay.
That influence is, and what you might call spoken word, right, poetry and performance, rap poetry, hip-hop poetry, is clearly a source of what people choose to write poems about and perform them. I doubt that the majority of our younger readers have any interest in publication. That's a big difference over the time. And the circle that I have moved in has largely included people who are actually quite eager to have their poems published, you know, on print or online. And that doesn't seem to be a concern. It may become a concern later. I mean, maybe they'll record it. You know, on the page, some of this stuff might not have its full impact. And that's kind of a crossroads that perhaps anyone who's participating in the poetry community is going to face. poetry on the page and poetry for the stage. Now that dichotomy is not new, but how many practitioners are going to stop caring about the page? That's a very interesting thing to think about, the broadest view of the poetry community. The people who are writing to be published, poetry for the page, and all the new blood that's coming in that doesn't put the same valorization or value on those aspects of it.
But even if they don't want to be printed or published in the traditional meaning, do they want to be, I don't know how to say, like broadcast, like they record it? Do they use other media, other venues to communicate, to transmit what they say?
This is the the selfie generation.
Yeah, exactly.
Obviously, do they want to share their minds, as it were, in this particular art form called poetry? Yes, yes. I think the impulses that lead one to any form of self-expression are still operative. And as I think I've pompously said, the ultimate goal is we want to be known as who we are and accepted. And this is kind of what people getting up in front of the mic and saying their words with more or less artfulness. That's, you see art develop. We see people come because we're a weekly reading. We see people often enough that we can see development. We can see basically a person's writing getting stronger, a person finding his or her voice.
Yeah.
That's marvelous.
I would like you to read one last poem. It's called At the Curb, Car Waiting, Boy Standing, to close the conversation.
Okay. I consider this my foundation poem, meaning it says something upon which everything I've written has been built.
When did you write the poem?
Probably 1996 or 7, when I was studying with Jack Grapes. So you may be familiar with his emphasis on write like you talk, okay, even though you know you're writing and not talking. At the curb, car waiting, boy standing. The blue 48 Plymouth is at the curb. The rear door open, the engine's running. All of my family is in the car. Father, mother, brothers, sister, waiting for me to get in. The house is locked. I want to be with them, but I cannot make myself move toward the open door. I do not want them to leave, but I don't know how to tell them. I stand on the sidewalk, arms at my sides, immobile, silent. The car begins to pull away, slowly, and I wake up. 40 years later, I remember what I had forgotten or never admitted about this dream. I am also in the car. Now, when hard choices pull up beside me and wait, I can't pretend I don't know what's at stake. But the boy does not forsake me. He is always waiting for me to return.
Thank you very much.
Mariano, thank you so much.
Thank you.